When Steve Harvey dropped his cards and walked away from his podium, nobody in the Family Feud studio knew what was happening. The cameras kept rolling, but this wasn't television anymore. This was the moment when a game show host became something infinitely more important, a voice for the voiceless, a champion for the forgotten, a man who understood that some stories need to be told even when they interrupt everything else. It started as an ordinary Tuesday afternoon taping in Atlanta. The Morrison family from Ohio faced off against the Watson family from North Carolina. Standard setup, standard energy, standard laughs. Steve was in his element, that perfectly tailored navy suit catching the studio lights, his infectious energy working the crowd like only he could. But something was different about the Watson family. Not immediately obvious, but there if you knew how to look. 11-year-old Amelia Watson stood at the end of their podium, her small hand resting protectively on the arm of the woman beside her. Carol Watson, 45, an elementary school teacher with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Next to her stood David Watson, 48, a mechanic whose calloused hands spoke of honest work and whose gentle demeanor suggested a man who chose love over biology. What the studio audience didn't know was the journey that had brought the Watson family to this moment. 4 years earlier, Carol and David had been a childless couple in their 40s, told by doctors that biological children weren't in their future. They'd grieved that loss quietly, privately, until the day Carol's colleague mentioned a 7-year-old girl who had been through 6 foster placements and was running out of options. Amelia had arrived at their doorstep with a garbage bag of belongings and eyes that had seen too much disappointment. She didn't trust easily, didn't speak much for the first month, and tested every boundary they set. But Carol and David saw something in her fierce independence and quiet intelligence that reminded them why they'd wanted to be parents in the first place. The first breakthrough came when Amelia found Carol crying in the kitchen after a particularly difficult day. Instead of retreating to her room as she usually did, Amelia had climbed onto Carol's lap and whispered, "It's okay to be sad sometimes. I learned that in my other houses." That night, Carol knew they weren't just fostering anymore. They were becoming a family. The adoption process had taken 18 months of court hearings, home visits, and paperwork that seemed endless. But the day the judge signed the final papers, Amelia had looked at Carol and David and said simply, "Can I call you Mom and Dad now?" There hadn't been a dry eye in the courthouse that day, including the usually stoic family court judge who had presided over the case. During family introductions, Steve had approached them with his trademark warmth. "And what do we have here? This beautiful family from North Carolina. I'm Carol, this is my husband David, and this is our daughter Amelia," Carol had said, her voice carrying a slight tremor that only someone listening carefully would catch. Steve knelt down to Amelia's level, as he always did with younger contestants. "Amelia, that's a beautiful name. How old are you, sweetheart?" 11, Amelia replied, her voice clear and confident despite her small stature. "And I want to be a teacher like my mom when I grow up." Something in the way she said "my mom" caught Steve's attention. There was emphasis there, intentionality, as if the words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. But the show moved on, and the moment passed. The game progressed normally through the first 3 rounds. The Watson family was holding their own against the Morrisons, trading leads with solid answers and good teamwork. Amelia hadn't buzzed in yet, content to cheer for her family from her position at the end of the podium. But with each correct answer, her confidence grew, her smile widened, and she began to truly inhabit her role, not just as a contestant, but as a Watson. During commercial breaks, production assistants noticed how naturally the family functioned together. David would adjust Amelia's collar with fatherly care. Carol would whisper encouragement in her ear. And Amelia would squeeze both their hands whenever the cameras rolled, grounding herself in their presence. The Watson family's journey to the show had begun 6 months earlier when Amelia saw the Family Feud casting call advertisement during her favorite after-school show. "Mom, Dad," she had called excitedly, "we should try out for this." Carol and David had initially dismissed it as childhood whimsy, but Amelia's persistence wore them down. They submitted their application video mostly to humor her, never expecting to be selected from thousands of hopeful families. When the call came that they'd been chosen, Amelia had danced around their small living room for 20 minutes straight. This wasn't just about potentially winning money, though the $20,000 prize could certainly help with college savings. This was about proving to herself and the world that the Watson family was real, legitimate, unbreakable. But during the 4th round, everything changed. The question was deceptively simple: name someone who loves you unconditionally. David Watson stepped up to the podium, confident after nailing the previous answer. Steve read the question with his usual enthusiasm, and David quickly responded, "Your mother." "Good answer," Steve announced as the board revealed it was the #1 response. The Watson family celebrated, and Steve was moving on to the next family member when something unexpected happened. Amelia's small voice cut through the celebration, "My real family right here." The studio didn't go silent immediately. A few people were still clapping from David's answer, but Steve heard her. He turned toward the Watson podium, his expression shifting from entertainer to something more focused. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Steve asked, walking closer to where Amelia stood. Amelia looked up at him with eyes that seemed far older than her 11 years. "My real family," she repeated, gesturing to Carol and David. "They're right here." Something in her tone made Steve pause completely. The cameras were still rolling, the audience was still engaged, but suddenly the game felt secondary. He looked at Carol and David, whose expressions had gone from celebration to something more complex. Pride mixed with protectiveness, love mixed with concern. Behind the scenes, the production crew exchanged glances. This wasn't following the script. This wasn't the typical flow of a Family Feud episode. But something in the air, something in the way Steve had stopped moving, told them to keep rolling. "Amelia," Steve said gently, crouching down so he was at her eye level, "tell me about your family." What happened next would stop the show completely. Amelia took a small step forward, closer to Steve. The studio lights caught the small silver locket around her neck, a gift from Carol and David on the day their adoption became final. "Carol and David aren't my biological parents," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "But they chose me when nobody else wanted me. They didn't have to love me, but they do, every single day." The studio fell completely silent. Not the polite quiet of a commercial break, but the profound silence of 300 people suddenly understanding they were witnessing something sacred. Steve remained crouched in front of Amelia, but his expression had transformed entirely. This wasn't the game show host anymore. This was Steve Harvey, the father, the man who understood that some moments transcend entertainment. In the control room, producers were frozen between continuing the show and recognizing that something unprecedented was happening. The director, a veteran of 20 years in television, made a split-second decision: let it play out. Sometimes television captured lightning in a bottle, and this felt like one of those moments. "How long have Carol and David been your family?" Steve asked softly. 4 years, Amelia replied. "I was in 6 different foster homes before them. Some were okay, some weren't, but Carol and David, they made me understand what a real family feels like." As she spoke, memories flashed through her mind. The night terrors that had slowly faded, as she learned to trust that she wouldn't be moved again. The first Christmas morning when she woke up in the same bed she'd gone to sleep in, under the same roof where people knew her name and loved her anyway. The parent-teacher conferences where Carol and David showed up, not out of obligation but out of genuine interest in her success. Behind them, Carol had tears streaming down her face. David's arm was around her shoulders, his own eyes glistening. They hadn't expected this moment, hadn't prepared for their daughter to share their story on national television, but they also knew better than to stop her. This was Amelia's story to tell, and she had every right to tell it. Steve slowly stood up, his cards forgotten on the podium. He looked at the production booth, then at the Morrison family, who were watching with their own tears beginning to form. "Stop the clocks," Steve called out, his voice carrying across the studio with unprecedented authority. "Stop everything." The game show music cut out, the audience held its collective breath. Even the camera operators seemed to sense that something unprecedented was happening. Steve walked to the center of the stage, positioning himself between both family podiums. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that transformed the entire studio. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve began, "we're about to do something that's never been done in the history of Family Feud. We're going to stop playing a game and start celebrating something much more important." He turned to face Carol and David directly. "Mr. and Mrs. Watson, would you please step forward?" Carol and David exchanged glances, then walked hand in hand to where Steve stood. Amelia followed, staying close to her parents, the family unit moving as one. "I need everyone in this studio to understand something," Steve continued, his voice now reaching every corner of the space. "What we just witnessed isn't just a sweet family moment. We just witnessed the definition of real love." The audience began to murmur, sensing something powerful building. Steve knelt down next to Amelia one more time. "Amelia, I want you to look at me, sweetheart. What Carol and David did for you, choosing to love you, choosing to make you their daughter, That's not just kindness, that's heroism. He stood and faced the audience directly. How many of you believe that family is about blood? A few hands went up tentatively. How many of you believe that family is about choice, about love, about showing up every single day? The entire studio erupted in applause. But Steve wasn't finished. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his personal business card. But instead of giving it to Amelia, he handed it to Carol and David. "Mr. and Mrs. Watson," he said, "I want you to have this, because what you've done, opening your hearts and your home to a child who needed you, that's the kind of story the world needs to hear. That's the kind of love that changes everything." Carol took the card with trembling hands. "Steve, we just did what felt right. Amelia chose us as much as we chose her." "No, ma'am," Steve replied, shaking his head. "You did something extraordinary. You proved that the strongest families aren't born, they're built. They're built with daily choices, with sacrifice, with the decision to love someone not because you have to, but because you want to." The camera caught every emotion playing across the faces in that studio. The Morrison family, their competition forgotten, were openly weeping. Audience members were reaching for tissues. Production crew members had stopped working entirely, caught up in the moment. In that silence, Amelia stepped closer to Steve. "Can I tell everyone something?" she asked, her voice small but determined. Steve nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Before Carol and David, I thought love was something you had to earn," Amelia said, her words carrying across the silent studio. "I thought if I was good enough, quiet enough, helpful enough, maybe someone would keep me. But Carol and David taught me that real love isn't about being perfect. It's about being chosen, just as you are." The profundity of those words, coming from an 11-year-old who had learned about love through loss and found it through choice, left everyone in the studio speechless. She continued, her voice growing stronger. "In my old houses, I used to pack my clothes every night before bed, just in case. I did that for the first 6 months with Carol and David too, until one morning Carol found my bag by the door and sat down on my bed. She said, 'Amelia, you don't ever have to pack again. This is your home, and we're your family, and nothing you do will ever change that.' That's when I knew what real love felt like." The revelation hit the studio like a wave. Here was a child who had lived with the daily fear of abandonment, who had learned to love while always being ready to leave, sharing the moment she finally understood that she belonged somewhere. But the most powerful moment came when Steve turned back to Amelia. "Amelia," he said, "I want you to know something that I wish every child could understand. The family that chooses you, that fights for you, that loves you not because they have to, but because they can't imagine their life without you, that's the most real family there is." He began removing his suit jacket, the same ritual that had become his signature gesture in moments like these. "This jacket," Steve said, draping it around Amelia's small shoulders, "has been with me through thousands of shows, but today it goes home with someone who understands what real family means." The jacket hung past Amelia's knees like a royal robe, but she wore it with dignity that seemed impossible for her age. "Now," Steve continued, "I want to do something else that's never been done on this show." He gestured for both families to come to center stage. The Morrisons left their podium without hesitation, gathering around the Watsons in a circle of support. "Today there are no winners and losers," Steve announced. "Today we celebrate the fact that love multiplies when it's shared. Both families are taking home the grand prize, because both families just reminded us what family really means." The studio erupted in the kind of applause that comes from the heart, not from prompting. It was the sound of recognition, of people seeing their own families reflected in this moment. As confetti fell and music played, Steve knelt next to Amelia one final time. "What you said today, about your real family being right here, that's going to help a lot of people understand something important. That love isn't about where you come from, it's about where you belong." Amelia looked up at him, still wrapped in his oversized jacket. "Steve," she said quietly, "can I tell you something?" "Anything, sweetheart." "Before Carol and David, I used to think something was wrong with me because my first parents didn't want me, but now I know they just made room for the right parents to find me." The wisdom in those words, coming from an 11-year-old who had lived through more uncertainty than most adults ever would, left Steve momentarily speechless. "Amelia," he finally said, "you just said something that's going to help a lot of grown-ups understand life better." Behind the cameras, seasoned crew members who had worked on hundreds of episodes found themselves wiping away tears. This wasn't just good television, this was a masterclass in human resilience, in the power of chosen family, in the way love can heal even the deepest wounds. The episode that aired 3 months later became the highest-rated Family Feud in the show's history, not because of the game but because of what happened when the game stopped mattering. The response was unprecedented. The show received over 150,000 messages from viewers sharing their own stories of chosen family, of adoption, of love that transcends biology. Foster care agencies reported increases in applications. Adoption organizations were flooded with inquiries. But perhaps the most powerful response came from the children who saw themselves in Amelia's story. Kids in foster care, kids who had been adopted, kids who lived with grandparents or aunts or family friends, all suddenly had language for what they'd always known, that real family is about love, not genetics. Steve Harvey said in interviews that Amelia's episode changed how he understood his role as a host. "I realized that day that my job isn't to run a game show," he explained. "My job is to create moments where people can see the best of humanity reflected back at them." The jacket Steve gave Amelia hangs framed in her bedroom, next to a photo from that day showing her surrounded by two families who had forgotten they were supposed to be competing. But the real legacy isn't in the jacket or the photo. It's in the conversations that started in living rooms across America. Conversations about what makes a family real. Conversations about chosen love being just as powerful as inherited love. Conversations about the children who need families and the families who need children. Carol and David Watson still receive letters from people inspired by their story. They've become advocates for foster care and adoption, speaking at events and sharing their journey. But they always make sure to credit Amelia for having the courage to speak her truth on national television. "She taught us as much as we taught her," Carol says. "That day on the show when she called us her real family, she wasn't just sharing our story. She was claiming her place in the world and giving permission for other kids to do the same." The impact extended far beyond the Watson family. Other foster families began reaching out, sharing their own stories of chosen love. Support groups formed. Online communities grew. What had started as one girl's declaration of belonging became a movement of families, celebrating the many ways love can create bonds. Amelia is now 15 and thriving. She's an honor student, a volunteer at local foster care events, and she still wants to be a teacher like her mom. She keeps Steve's business card in her wallet, not because she needs it, but because it reminds her that her story matters. Every year on the anniversary of the adoption, the Watson family watches that episode together. It's become their tradition, their way of remembering not just that day in the television studio, but the journey that brought them together and the love that keeps them strong. On the anniversary of that episode every year, Steve Harvey receives the same text message: "Still grateful for my real family. Thank you for helping me tell the world." It's signed simply, Amelia Watson, because that's her name, not the name she was born with, but the name she chose, the name that represents the family that chose her back, the name that proves love is always stronger than biology. The lesson Amelia taught that Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta is simple but revolutionary. Family isn't about who you're born to, it's about who shows up, who stays, who chooses you every single day. And sometimes it takes an 11-year-old girl in an oversized suit jacket to remind a television studio full of adults what real love actually looks like. The story continues to ripple outward, touching lives in ways that television rarely does. Because in the end, it wasn't about entertainment or ratings or even the money. It was about recognition, about belonging, about the fundamental human need to be chosen and loved exactly as we are. And in that moment when Amelia Watson claimed her place in the world, she gave permission for countless others to do the same.